Is our belief about evolution just culturally conditioned by our religion or our education? Or have we been critically engaging the topic? Today, I'm going to interview Dr. Rachel Pear, one of my colleagues on the project that I work on at Oxford. And she's going to discuss how Jews in Israel and Arabs, Muslims, and Arab Christians in Israel slice and dice the issue of whether they should believe in evolution or not. So I know you will enjoy it. She talks very fast, but she has so many good things to say. So listen up.
So, hi Drew, I'm Rachel Pear, as you know, Rachel Shoulder Abrams Pear, technically, as you know, us
That's
women.
the essay. In
Yep, I
Rachel
have my
S.A.
mother's
Pear.
maiden name, my maiden name, whatever those loaded terms entail. Hard to define ourselves. But I was born in New York City, and now I live in Jerusalem. I think I've mentioned to you before that, according to my mother, I started asking questions about the interface of Genesis and science when I was about 3 years old. I really like the dinosaurs and prehistoric animals, as a lot of 3-year-olds do, and I was looking for them in the text and wondering how they related to the Garden of Eden and whatnot. So in my wedding video, she talks about how, while most 3-year-olds sort of grow out of that phase, I've stayed interested in those questions, and I studied prehistoric archaeology as an undergrad at Columbia College. I got to go to do some field school in China, in Jiaqudian, which is sometimes known as the Peking Man site. And there again is a gender question, because some of the fossils they had found, skeletal remains, may have actually been from a female, so Pecan woman site.
Right. And that
So
would be determined by the hip bone, right? Is that correct?
yeah, that's one of the very
Okay.
defining characteristics. They found a lot of interesting things at that site. Actually, we were one of the first American delegations that were allowed to excavate at the site. There was, a lot of sort of cultural issues. So even though I went there as a strictly prehistoric archaeology or paleoanthropology student, I already started cluing in to sort of other questions that became more relevant for me later on. The delegation was led by Alison Brooks, who's a she's, I think, paleoanthropologist. I don't know exactly how she would define herself, but she was really an amazing woman and scholar. And she led the delegation through George Washington University, but allowed students from all over. And she was super accommodating to my requests about Shabbat and
Right.
kosher food and all those kinds of things. So it was really fun to be.
Yeah, how do you do kosher in China?
So the way we worked it out was where we lived, there were a lot of vegetarians on our group. There were, I think, about 11 students, and maybe at least half of them were vegetarian. So we got like a new wok, and all the veggie food was cooked in the kosher pot.
Okay.
And I
Okay.
had like my own bowl and spoon, and I was really, I was on cloud 9, because it was like the best food I had had in my whole life. It was like incredible food. I mean, I'm not a vegetarian, but I did not miss meat at all.
Right.
Everything was so good. There were dumplings and everything. It was just,
Amazing.
yeah, it was amazing. For lunch, we were not eating on site because we were digging. Basically, what it was a quarry where they had found these bones. We found mostly animal bones, fauna. So it was a cement quarry. So it was not the most pleasant digging
Wow.
site, because they isolated off this part. So for lunch, the cooking was done in a different kitchen. So I didn't have my kosher pot access. So I just brought sort of like a can of tuna with me. But then there was watermelon and cucumbers and all sorts of yummy things. And then when we went to travel, first of all, I got to go to a Jewish community in Beijing. There, actually, the food was not kosher, because it was not at that time, they didn't have like sort of a kosher observant Jewish community, but it was just really fun to still go and pray and be with them on a Friday night. I separated from the group just for like a day for that. And
Was
then when I
that,
was with the group,
sorry,
sorry,
I got to ask about that. Was that
yeah,
a Chinese Jewish community or
it was
like
mostly
expatriates?
expats, yeah,
Okay,
but like
because there is
some
a
also.
Chinese Jewish community as well, right?
That's fascinating, I know, but I was sort of just like in this group and just sort of it was kind of like the first time in my life growing up in the Jewish community in New York that I hadn't seen another Jewish person or been able to like join a service for so many weeks. So it was just it was on the one hand it was somewhat of a cultural experience, but it would have been a lot more interesting also to learn more about the history of the community and things along those lines. But
Hmm.
this was just sort of like a quick foray. Also, I was let's see, how old was I? I don't know. I guess this was a really long time ago. I was about 20 and now I'm 48. But I guess it's still quite fresh in my memory that I'm deciding to talk about it. So
Right. Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot. But yeah, but then anyway, with the group, like they all wanted to go to like Pizza Hut and stuff, which, was like less on the kosher list. But then they were also really happy to go with me to like a Buddhist restaurant that was very strictly vegetarian. So then I was back on cloud nine about all the amazing veggie food. So wait, I don't know how I got on that
Well,
China tangent, but
yeah,
I
this is fascinating to me.
cool.
Sorry,
I'm,
so
I'm
I don't want to
feeling
distract
inspired.
you too
Yeah,
much.
sorry. I had wanted to go to Africa for field school,
Right.
but China was a good alternative. So anyway, all I was saying is a part of the controversy at the time was there were sort of two competing theories about the evolution of modern humans. One was called multi-regionalism, and the other was called the out of Africa approach, and Chinese scholars, interesting for me, were felt very tied to the multi-regionalist approach, and they wanted to see physiological continuities between these very archaic and ancient populations, before Homo sapiens with modern populations. And that was like just interesting for me that cultural heritage could span back so many hundreds of thousands of years. And the woman and the professor Alison Brooks, who was leading our delegation, I think she actually happened to be married to a Jewish man, and they would take their kids out to field school. Yellen, something Yellen. They would take their kids to do field work in Africa. She was amazing. She told a story that her advisor had only accepted her to do her PhD because he thought she was gay, because he didn't want to have a student who would become a mother because he thought that would make them sort of abandon their academic
Because gay people don't become mothers.
at the time. She's much older. If
Yeah.
I'm 48, she's many decades older than me. So at the time, that was what she was facing. So he almost like stopped advising her completely when he found out that she either was getting married or something along those lines. But she's an amazing scholar who I am actually working with someone who still works with her to this day. And she actually came to my wedding. She danced at my wedding with me. So I really appreciate her. She's an out of Africa theorist, exactly. So she had to sort of be very diplomatic. We had colleagues, we worked with Chinese colleagues there, and it was really interesting to me to see sort of those cultural aspects of the questions of how we relate to these stories of human evolution. As I said, I also was always very tied to the stories of human evolution, and they're very meaningful to me for a lot of different reasons, also in terms of sort of the unity of humankind and all sorts of what some might say are spiritual aspects of the
Mm.
story of human evolution always really spoke to me. And I grew up in a Jewish community that never sort of questioned that you could hold evolutionary approach and a religious approach. So I didn't really grow up with those questions about evolution. And I was just sort of very enchanted with it all, and I never had the friction there.
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters.
So we were getting to how I got to what I began to study. But then when I came to Israel and I started my master's degree at Hebrew University in prehistoric archaeology, in America it's more called paleoanthropology, and in Israel more prehistoric archaeology. There were amazing scholars here, and Israel happens to be a very interesting location for the field because it's a land bridge that connects Africa and Asia and Europe. So
Yeah,
there
the
were
Rift Valley
fascinating
that goes
finds.
straight through Uganda and Kenya comes all the way up there into Israel, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there were different migrations out of Africa through Israel, and there were all sorts of fascinating finds. I could just give one example, which is, for example, in Israel, the anatomically modern human sites, the early anatomically modern human sites, were dated earlier than the Neanderthal sites. Because in the European chronology, obviously you have Neanderthals and then modern humans, and in Israel it seemed different. And also just even defining these different populations and what really differentiated these populations. Did they have different technologies? Did they have different behavioral patterns? So some of my professors were the first ones to try to argue that Neanderthal behavior wasn't that different, and they had found burial practices by Neanderthals, and they were writing papers that weren't getting accepted on these topics because, again, to me, looking back on it, or I think even at the time, the idea of sort of these cultural understandings of what it means to be human and what it means to be non-human, and Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, all of these things seem to be very loaded. So, but one thing I did notice when I came to Israel, people are like, you consider yourself a religious observant person, part of that community. You're married to a rabbi. Have
Right.
co-founded a synagogue and all these things, and you're in, the archaeology of human evolution. How that those two things are, stay separate. So all of a sudden, I was encountering these different cultural assumptions. Excuse me, even though, it might be somewhat parallel religious communities, sort of a more modern or open or liberal. It's not an ultra orthodox
Right.
lifestyle, but still different assumptions about where evolution fits in. So that was really interesting to me. And even though I spent my whole archaeology degree really focusing in on the particulars of prehistoric archaeology, because even though it was my major in college, in Columbia, we were a liberal arts college, so it was nothing like the Israeli system, because in Israel you apply to a particular program, so it was,
Yeah. You
now
study
I have
one thing
kids who do
basically.
that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
In the Israeli system, you basically study one thing or one small
Exactly.
cluster of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one daughter now who didn't want to study one thing, so she had to apply to a program that's sort of like a triple
Right.
degree. But so only in the last year of my master's, I took a course called Human Evolution and Human Nature, Questions for Education and Jewish Education. And that sort of changed my trajectory. It was by someone named Elon Schwartz, who I'm still in touch with because he works on issues of dialogue in Israeli society. And those are issues I'm very drawn to till today. And I've partnered with him on a few things, but he sent me to one of his best friends who started a program at Bar Ilan University, an STS program, Science, Technology, and Society, Noah Efron, who's worked on the interface of Judaism and science, and said, if you want to focus in on understanding the history, the sociology, about this question of why some Jewish communities might think there is a friction and some Jewish communities might not think there's a friction, that's where you go. I mean, the first statement Noah said to me when I met him, he's like, you seem like you're coming at this thinking about it more like it's just a philosophical question, but I think it's a social question. And obviously, I don't think that the social aspects of the question negate the theological or philosophical questions, but it just says, like, most traditions have so many options in their arsenal, and historically different choices have been picked by different communities or different leaders or different thinkers or different lay people. And why is it? Why in one time period or in one community they will choose one and somewhere else they'll choose another, and trying to understand the broader contours of how it fits into other questions and debates and discussions. That became the focus of my dissertation. I looked at the community I was raised in, American Modern Orthodoxy, from the Scopes trial until the present. The present at the time was, I think, 2012, and look at how the reactions to evolution and Darwinism had changed over the course of that period. And since then, for a postdoc at the University of Haifa, I've gotten to do some work looking at what's happening now in Israeli schools, how policymakers, teachers, and students view the issue, in three different streams of the school system: the Arabic-speaking stream, the secular or general stream, and the religious Jewish stream. and a bunch of other different questions and projects related to science and religion. That was a very long answer to your question, Drew. I'm sorry.
Well, and you've probably raised, 20 different questions in some listeners' minds, including their like the Arabic speaking schools in Israel. I mean,
Yeah,
people often
20%
go
of the population here.
is
Yeah,
Arabic,
we.
and then some of them, if you find a Christian in Israel, maybe outside of Jerusalem, they're probably Arabic, right? Arab Israeli, otherwise Muslim.
My good friend Nijmi, she is writing her PhD just on Muslim responses to evolution in Israel. So she's still working on the material, but we've already heard some interesting things from that community. And I got to also experience it. I got to go into both a Christian Arab school and a Muslim Arab schools and talk to teachers and students about the issues, and it's super different. It's seeing those differences is just fascinating, and looking at the nuances of it was just something I loved and really enjoyed.
I want to come back to the multi-regionalism in a second, but just what you mentioned there, could you give one example to help people imagine what this is like in a Muslim Arabic school versus a Christian Arabic school?
So in the Christian school where I was, it was the friar who was in charge. He's like in charge of Christian education.
Where was this?
This was in Lod.
Lod, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Just down the highway.
And yeah. So and then I went to a different Christian Arab an hour later or a few hours later, and he gave me a totally different story because he was Orthodox as opposed to
Okay.
Jesuits.
Okay.
I say Christian, and obviously there's so many different flavors
Right.
and spectrums there. So what I'm going to say here is more, I would assume, for the Catholic. But in Israel, because much of the Christian education is also led by this stream, so that it might have a trickle effect to other populations as well. But basically, I was in one class. So the friar said to me, he said, we have no problem with evolution as Christians, but we can't teach it in our schools because half of our students are Muslim, and you have to respect the ideas of the home and the family. So we can't teach something in school that's against the values of the family. And so it was interesting to hear that, but then I went into the classroom and the students told me the same exact thing. One of them raised their hands and said, well, as a Christian, I accept evolution, but it's not okay for Muslims. And so that was sort of like a known understanding. And that also was super striking to me coming from America, where I don't think that would have been the default understanding that as a Christian we accept it, but there are other religious communities who don't, like just all these givens was like fascinating to me. And also talking to some of the teachers. One of the Christian teachers, she said she grew up going to a Christian school where it was not addressed. So when she studied biology in college, she had to go to her priest and be like, what do we think about this? And he's like, it's fine, don't worry about it. So she didn't delve into it so much, but she knew it was like, okay. And again, she also perpetuated the perspective of, even though she really wanted critical thinking from her students and things along those lines, it's hard to think that you might be violating the family. This is something that comes up in Jewish schools as well. How do you approach sort of a socially controversial issue? If parents are going to have a very strong view about it, what is your role as a principal, as a science coordinator, as a teacher? Are you supposed to just like sidestep and be like, we can't talk about this because it's something that lots of different people have lots of different ideas about it? Or should you say, let's try to talk about it and let's try to see how we can discuss issues that we don't agree on? That was sort of one of the questions we were looking at. But I think I wanted to say one other thing about the issue. But the science educator, she was really interesting also because it was one of the first times also, again, as an American, she was talking about her Christian identity vis-a-vis, because of the 20% Arabic-speaking population in Israel, 18% is Muslim, more or less, and 2% is Christian. So again, I grew up in a Christian majority culture, obviously, and here Christians, she considered herself an ultra minority. It was sort of the tables were turned. If I grew up in a place where Jews made up, less than whatever percent, even if New York it was slightly skewed, but still, here it was the reverse, as opposed to a Jewish person growing up in a Christian majority culture. Here was a Christian growing up in a Jewish majority culture with a prominent Muslim sort of minority majority and self-defining herself. She said that for her, Christianity was sort of like an identity. But it just seemed so different than both Jewish and Muslim identities, which were so focused on practice. And for her, because she had just so many close friends that were Jewish and Muslim, and they were always focused on all these sort of practice issues, which were less relevant for her. It was like something that came up, and I don't want to say it was a huge struggle, but it was certainly an issue that I found really, really interesting. That made me want to try to spend more time with that community, understanding it and talking to people, because it was sort of so different and so similar to my own place, and I found it fascinating.
And for, I think, a lot of people, it's a lot of Americans who, we have a lot of American and British listeners, but it's difficult for them to wrap their minds around that in Israel, and maybe larger in Southwest Asian culture, Jews and Muslims see themselves much more alike each other as religions than they do to Christians, right? They see these Christians kind of doing this other thing out there, but Jews and Muslims, they're both this
Yeah.
family. They have, dietary restrictions.
If I ever made that comparison in my own mind, like I happen to love multi-faith encounters, so I love, meeting Christians and Muslims and all the different faiths. So I don't know if I ever, but definitely hearing it from her that she was doing that lumping was interesting, because I don't know if I would have made that exact dichotomy that she did, and how the different people sort of do it. Obviously, in America, there's tons of Jewish Christian organizations, and obviously there are also some Jewish Muslim organizations, but just all those differences of the associations.
Yeah. And and again, I do want to get back to the multi-regionalism thing in a second here, but I think, maybe it's a symptom, and I'm thinking of your trajectory as a scholar, starting out and just field work and doing normal archaeological study, and then you go to China and you find out that your theory is actually not determined, maybe, but heavily influenced by your national identity, and your even kind of a broad Confucianism that says our ancestors came from this land, right, in China.
Yeah, I definitely don't think determined. I'm not a determinist, but
Right.
just interacts with,
Yeah.
just like if we thought of science as this sort of isolated, neutral sphere. I know in our conference, Mark was talking about Bruno Latour and a lot of people who tried to sort of like bust those myths of just science being separate. Science is part of our lives. Science is made by people. So I definitely don't think it's determined at all. But I did start thinking it was fascinating, and then I would took courses, and my other advisor was a historian of biology, Orrin Harmon, and he wrote about the history of biology, and he explained how Peter Kropotkin was an anarchist, and he saw mutual aid, how species came to help one another, and yes, it could have to do also with the environment in which he was working. So it's not strictly a philosophical perspective, but can we ignore the fact of Britain being this sort of newly industrial society, and how that interacted with the understanding of evolutionary theory that was then described as survival of the fittest and very competition oriented. So again, it's not that these aren't concepts in science. It's certainly not trying to negate science at all. It's not trying to say that it's purely culture, but it's just trying to see it as all interacting.
Yeah, I think they have a phrase in science that all data are theory laden. And you could also say, and all theories are culturally interacted, right?
Enmeshed.
Yeah, enmeshed. Yeah, entangled.
Situated.
For good and and sometimes for ill, right?
Yeah, and you're going to have different people. There's what was called the strong program. Sometimes people want to argue the case like to an extreme when it's first brought up, and then you want to sort of think about it, and then people fight back, and there are the science wars, and
Right.
How legitimate is this anthropology of, sociology of, history of science,
Yeah.
and how far should they go, and how I and a lot of my peers respect science, but like you sort of have to maybe like say that, and you're not trying to dismantle this sphere that has brought so much good and discovered so much that even the word discovery is sometimes contested, because the question is it invented or discovered or whatever the case may be. But basically, obviously, science is amazing, and I am not trying to deconstruct it in a negative way and bring strictly critiques, but obviously there are then some critiques that come up in terms of, eugenics was considered a science at a certain time, and it wasn't only in Nazi Germany. In America, there were people, black people, for example, who were against their will, not without their knowledge. There were women whose tubes were tied as a young child. There was a case that was only settled not too long ago about a woman who only found out decades later, when she was trying to have children, that she was considered problematic by the courts, and this was done to her. So I'm just saying, like, learning about the history of science is fascinating. Yes, sometimes it makes you ask questions of what is considered science or scientific, and all the prestige that word brings to whatever is defined with that category. But certainly not without the, what you would say in Hebrew, hakarat tov, like the appreciation of everything that science brings. So I think that it's wrong to divide it in that sort of a dichotomy of and I think that, that's not where we're at. I was just sort of doing a preventative kind of work there, and in those last few sentences maybe I was getting defensive.
It's necessary, because as much as you hear people hating on cancel culture today in America, right, but those same people will, in a heartbeat, will say, well, science told us eggs were unhealthy, and now they say they're healthy. We can't trust any of this, right?
Exactly.
They just take the same cancel culture mentality and they apply it to science.
Like, religion hasn't evolved. Everything changes with time. So it's like, that's what sometimes when I was studying science and religion and the history of both, it's like I was an equal opportunity offender, because I was talking about the enmeshed nature of both spheres, because I was talking about how religion was connected to culture and science was connected to culture, and how they were interacting. So, I guess sort of what we were talking about before, I just like I can respect and appreciate and enjoy different cultural perspectives, religious perspectives. I wasn't definitely not coming in with an anti-science at all, and I think that sometimes maybe projected onto the kind of research that looks at the social context, and it's not simple. I'll say that I was recently, the project that I was talking about in the school system, it was a collaboration with science educators. And just like finding the language to talk about these issues of religious views of evolution. And they were thinking about it as, a science education project. Like, here's the science. We need to get the people to understand it. We need to get the people to accept it. And I was working with a philosopher of education who specializes in religious education. And, he was seeing it a little bit differently. Not that he didn't accept he had no problem with evolution. And, he had no problem, he thought maybe you even do have to teach for acceptance, but you also have to understand, well, what if there are students who feel that this is against their values? Are you just sort of like, first of all, do you let them talk about it in class? In America, it's more complicated because of the strict separation of church and state. In England, we had colleagues in England and in Israel, we have different laws regarding those issues.
Right.
Sometimes it's even controversial, but there was a leading science educator who's also a priest in the Church of England, and he's like, we don't have to tell people in science class they can't talk about or mention their sort of religious questions or issues with the subject. That will only sort of assist if you are looking for the education process. Like, if people are told to shut down their questions, then how are they going to be able to listen and be open to learning about evolution? So one of the projects that I spent a lot of time on was here in Israel, when I understood that there was such a strong, as it turned out, it wasn't maybe as deep, but it was a widespread sort of cultural stigma against religion and evolution going together. So I worked with two colleagues who actually were both in the STS program, doing their graduate school training there as well, who were both rabbis. One of them wrote his PhD just on Rabbi Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, and the other wrote about Rabbi Schneerson, who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then he went on, that was in his master's, and then in his PhD went on to write about Rabbi Steinsaltz. If you know him, he's a more contemporary, Dean Steinsaltz. He passed away a few years ago here in Israel. A fascinating figure. I'll tell you about him another time. But he translated the whole Talmud and all sorts of interesting things. But anyway, so we wound up doing sort of a road show around some schools and things where we would present 3 different rabbinic views on evolution. So I presented Rabbi Soloveitchik, who you've heard me talk about a bit, and he had a very positive view about evolution, but from a certain sort of philosophical, kind of rationalist perspective. Then my colleague who talked about Rav Kook, he also had a positive view of evolution. I read him as a super positive view of evolution. I'd love to show you some of his texts on it. And those texts are very powerful for Israeli school children because he's such a well-known voice. So he said such good things about evolution. But he came from more of like a mystical tradition. So he had different reasons for sort of the positive view of evolution. And Dove sort of presents him not necessarily as super positive as I do. He sees him just saying like, there's no problem with it, He's not. And then the Lubavitcher Rebbe was actually a negative. He moved from Eastern Europe to America and served as the chief rabbi of the Lubavitch Chabad community in America from the 1940s. He, in the 60s, wrote sort of anti-evolution perspectives. So first of all, maybe it's interesting that in this seminar, we sort of presented 3 different views that were all not agreeing with each other. So some of the students were just happy, like, oh, what does Judaism say about the subject? You're not giving me one answer. You're giving me 3 different answers from people who actually knew each other. They had met each other. They were compatriots. They respected each other. And they disagreed on this sort of central issue. And that already sort of like took the tension down. Like, okay, I could think different things about the subject. Now let me think like, okay, there were rabbis I respect who, said positive things about it, so I can assess it for myself, and I could learn about it. And sort of, because in the school system, basically what happened, there was a time period where evolution wasn't taught by the teachers because they felt like it was too loaded. And then in 2014, it was made a mandatory section, so it was a small amount of the ecology units. It was a major in biology, you major already here in high school, had to study it. So we said, all well and good for the science biology curriculum department to decide that, but if it wasn't taught because it was this controversial issue and now it's just mandated as taught, like, don't we need a process here of sort of helping the teachers and the students talk about the issues? And that's what we were offering in this regard. And then we wound up developing professional development course for teachers because they all had all these questions themselves. So how are they supposed to teach it to students when they already had all these questions? And we were sort of trying to give them, again, this approach of let's look at different views on the subject, and then you could think about it. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, but it was just like interesting being a part of it. I'm sorry, I know I had a bunch of different things to say, but it looks like you also have some questions.
Well, I have so many questions that we don't have time to get to, but I do. I often tell people, like, one of the sad things about American education is the only time we talk about epistemology in the American public school system, that is a theory of knowledge, is basically when we teach scientific method. It's the only time we really say, like, here's how you know something confidently.
Yeah, but we do it in such a minor way
I
there
know.
also,
We
like
teach this one method as
such
if
a
that's what
rote,
science
like,
actually does.
boring way of
Yeah.
it's like.
And so it's not when you actually talk to working scientists and you say, how do you know what you know confidently? They have a much more enlivening story to tell you about.
Yeah.
And
I
I
have
think
to admit, I did not enjoy science in high school. It was like the
no, of
most
course
sort of
not. Yeah.
monotonous sort of monologue. Like my Judaic studies were much more sort of dialogue and debate and have different ideas, and science just seemed like so. I'm not saying it is, obviously, as you
Right,
said,
it's
that's like a
not. Yeah.
transition, but for students to be exposed to it in that way is like a
Yeah.
shame.
Well, and again, it kills the imagination for what people actually know. And I think that's to the point. Is it gets taught even amongst American evangelicals who want people to engage critically and positively with evolutionary theory. There can be a tendency to say, this is just the facts. You need to get on board with it. Or maybe they don't say it that way, but that's kind of how it comes across, is very like, this is just what's true, and you need to get on board with it so you can get
And I
on with
have
your life.
sympathy because I have to say, while my colleague is teaching Rabbi Schneerson's anti-evolution view, my blood is boiling. I mean, like, do I want to give legitimacy to this anti-evolutionism?
Right.
Like, that's hard for me. I'm not saying I'm not like anything goes, pluralism, science, schmice, everyone,
Right.
chocolate, vanilla, whatever you think, like it's hard for me making space for him to sort of, and he's brilliant, so he's like totally, getting the students to think about these epistemological questions and challenging all these things that I take as given. So it's really not easy, the process also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that helping students to see for themselves, like, okay, well, how do so like Peking Man, I don't know what the dates are. I assume a
Yeah,
couple
and then
hundred
I just want
thousand
to say
years.
also, like, that gets to, again, like, also my goals. So, like, what if a student is like blown away by my brilliant colleague? He starts questioning all these things, and then I've been a part of something that makes them start questioning science. Like all these sort of like background questions of like,
Right.
what am I doing? Am I creating good or bad by this whole process? So all I'm trying to say is all these interesting conversations and values that we hold, there are also other values and other questions that come up that make it, this whole process that we're sort of trying to deal with in the science religion interface. So I want to like be very honest about all
Yeah.
the complexity it entails. I'm sorry, but we want to go back to China for a minute.
Well, and even just thinking like evolutionary theory broadly, this is why I always love to talk to historians of science. Whenever you say, well, science says, or science
Right.
thinks this, they're like, well, right now it does, but it will
And also
certainly
a
think
certain
something
branch, just like we
differently.
said about Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
some.
So in 100 years, we know whatever evolutionary theory is, it'll look different. Whatever theories in physics and quantum mechanics will look different in 100 years.
Which
And it's
again,
not,
it's hard for me as a human, as I said. Like I'm very in love with evolution, so like I'm wondering, like how much is it really going to change? Like, yes, I'm appreciative of the fact that, like, let's say, everyone loves to complain about Dawkins, but he's an easy target, of
yeah,
like
yeah.
his
We don't,
selfish
we're not
genes and
taking
all
him
of his
seriously in this
whatever. Like
conversation.
I can see how that's culturally loaded and that's like an interpretation that's going to change. But as I said, even someone in it who's like so drunk the Kool-Aid and takes the scientific narrative as it is now, like it's hard to have that imagination to like
Yeah.
think about what might change, even though I'm really so convinced by the current evidence of what
Right.
we
Well, and that's why I
think
think the
about
critical
evolution.
voices, and by change, I don't mean it's going to evolve or progress and necessarily. I mean, there's good reasons in the philosophy of science and the history of science to say they'll just be different metaphors because we have different understandings of how things work more generally.
Exactly.
And so it might sound very different, but just be, it, I don't want to get into the history of science and like Kuhnian paradigm shifts and whether a paradigm shift is actually a new view or just a remetaphorized view.
Yeah.
But
And hopefully it'll help us solve more of the pain and suffering
solving,
that we have in this world and
yeah.
like help us figure out things with genetics that can help with disease and
And
you
I
know.
think that I think one thing that critical interaction with evolution from the Christian side, what's been good for it is it's actually sharpened lazy thinking and kind of evolutionary populists who just go out there and say, oh, it's pretty easy. This is how it kind of works, right? And then some people come back and say, well, not so fast. I'm a scientist. I work in this field, and what you're saying doesn't actually work the way. And I think that when I would imagine that when younger people, I mean, maybe not high school, but college age, and once the frontal lobe is developed, and they can get that, they can work in black, white, and gray. I think what you see is people need to see for themselves. Okay, this is how paleontologists date things, and here's why they do it this way.
And
This
there
is
are lots of reasons. It's not just like one,
right, right,
bogey
right. There's
test.
not a
There's
single
so
dating
many
method. Yeah,
corroborations from all
right.
different lines of evidence
So
and
when we talk about dendrochronology, we're talking about things in this dating period. When we're talking about carbon 14, we're talking about this
we're
period.
looking at what animal bones
Right,
they're finding
right.
from that
What kind
period.
of
We're looking at
pollens are in the air,
about the
and
flora,
yeah,
like so I'm saying once you're so immersed in that, and also as I said, because I was coming from like a spiritual background, which so much valued science, and basically I think we started talking about this maybe in the workshop as well, like that same rabbi who I had mentioned, he says, we have to imitate God. And what is the first message we see about God? Creation. And he saw the scientific endeavor as sort of our most highest human expression of ourselves, because we could partner with God in creation and help bring the world to where it needs to go. So seeing science in this highly valorized way, obviously now I understand that maybe it was a bit of an overshot, and like he wasn't even open maybe to seeing also that, yes, science has brought huge good. There's been
Right.
some negatives,
Right.
like science has created good and evil, but just sort of that aim of through science is how we can partner with God was just sort of like very central to my
Yeah.
education.
Well, I mean, I've
So it
written a
was like a
few
real
books.
spiritual message.
I have a few books arguing directly that the Hebrew Bible is advocating essentially the basis for the scientific program.
So yeah, who are you thinking of for that?
Me.
I'm curious. No, I'm saying which books are you?
Oh, all, like the whole view of epistemology is essentially it essentially creates a
Oh,
program that.
including right, including what you brought.
Yeah,
You mean
yeah,
you
yeah,
agree with that school of
yeah. I
thought?
agree with that
So
sentiment.
you
That yeah.
understand it's not so crazy that that's how I was sort of
No, no,
educated or
and
whatever.
I think it's good and right. I wonder for Jews, and this is one thing, obviously we can't speak for all Jews, but there is something in
Oh, I'm willing
Judaism.
to do that. Don't worry
Yeah,
about it.
there's something in
That's what I'm here
Judaism
for.
writ large, at least today, that Christians have trouble understanding, and that's kind of, I know you're talking about some resistance to these ideas, to ideas of evolution in sectors of Judaism, but really, like Christians can't get their minds around what I just learned the term Jews, right? That you can have a Buddhist Jew who is Jewish but fully Buddhist and maybe doesn't even believe in the God of Israel, but is fully welcomed within Shabbat dinner and comes to the festivals, right? And there are also, as you said, there are rabbis who say like, yeah, you can believe whatever you want about evolution because that's not a defeater. That's not something that like shuts down Judaism or the Jewish beliefs about the
Well,
world.
many of the rabbis will argue that evolution is supportive. Like that's what Rabbi Cook was arguing. He's like, thank goodness the world has gotten to this threshold because he thought Judaism, spiritually, philosophically, already, obviously he was talking about evolution in a progressionist sort of perspective, but he was saying this has always been the Jewish view and now like, other thinking is coming back to it. But I think what you're pointing to is that Jewish can be a designation of identity that's not just a religious identity. It could be a national identity. It could be a lot of different. So again, I don't know. You could tell me what all the analogies would be in Christian, but you're saying to
We don't
be
have analogies to a lot of
okay.
these in
So to
Christianity.
consider
That's
yourself
why it's interesting.
a
Yeah.
Christian is strictly a faith and belief sort of
Faith and
perspective.
practice, but yeah, and you belong to certain communities, but it's not. There's nothing that directly matches what I've seen in a lot of Jewish
So here
communities.
you're born into it. Like
Yeah,
it's not so easy to leave the definition of being a Jew. You could be a
right.
non-practicing Jew. You could be an atheist Jew. You could be a secular Jew. As I said in Israel, the secular Jewish identity is extremely strong, and also maybe that's why sort of the religious Jewish identity in response, for example, on the evolution issue, might I didn't bring it, but there's this Pew study that they did, I think, in 2016, and when they asked the evolution question. So I think 80 something percent of secular, answered positively on the evolution question, and then for the other, I'm trying to remember the other statistics now. I think people who identified themselves as dati, as religious, they used the Hebrew terms in the Pew. They just wrote them in English. I think it was only 11%, and that wasn't including ultra Orthodox. For ultra Orthodox, it was somewhere like in the single digits, like 1 or
Wow.
3%
Okay.
answered positively. And then those who define themselves as Masorati, traditional, which is the other sort of category here in Israel, also only answered positively in the 30 something percent. Again, because it was sort of this cultural assumption of being, attaching respect and honoring in the Muslim and the Jewish world. They had similar statistics in the Muslim world, as opposed to a secular perspective on it. We had this funny story once where we were on vacation, and my nephew made friends with a secular Israeli boy who came to sit with us at a Friday night, and I said, we're going to do this prayer called the Kiddush. Do you guys do it in your home? Because like lots of people do Kiddush, you don't have to look necessarily observant or Kippur or whatever. He's like, no, in our home we believe in the Big Bang. So it was sort of like associated as oppositional in that context again, which is not what I was coming from in the Jewish world. In the Jewish world in America, you will have sort of denominational identities of a Reformed Jew, a conservative Jew, an Orthodox Jew, and then within Orthodoxy you're going to have all the different things. I just said my group is called Modern Orthodoxy. Some people hate the term, but and those things are also totally changing, these like dividing lines of what is conservative, what is modern Orthodox. Those are things that I got to learn through my research. Also the history of, as I said, just not only the scientific side, the religious side too. And evolution was a part of it. Actually, in some of the stories I saw, I was trying to figure out, in terms of responses to the Scopes trial, I saw these very different responses by two rabbis from Manhattan, which is my hometown. One was David de Sola Pool, who is the rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, which is a very, one of the oldest communities in America. And he had a very positive view about evolution, which is sort of what I would expect, because in that period I saw mostly rabbis who were very open. It was Rabbi Cook, but it was like more of the general assumption. The person who wrote their PhD on Judaism and evolution before me, Shai Cherry, he found of all the Jews the leaders that he surveyed, the only one who was opposed actually was a Reform rabbi at the beginning, because he had sort of moral questions about what evolution would mean. So it was not a left-right split at all. And
Reform, by the way, does not mean reformed in the Christian sense at all. It means more progressive liberal in the Jewish sense. Yeah, so it's surprising that he would be questioning
So it was
evolution.
not a left-right thing. And then they actually found that some of the traditionalists were using evolution to fight against their reform. They said, you're not allowing for the gradualism of evolution that we see in the physical world to happen also, like sort of the forerunners of modern Orthodoxy, because they said that would be the better way. You reformers are trying to do these, jumps of evolution, which sort of violate these laws. Anyway, so where were we talking about? I'm trying to figure out now where I had got to, because the point was that these two rabbis, so David de Sola Pool had this positive view of evolution, which was what I was expecting because it was what I was seeing. And then the rabbi of the Jewish Center, which is this other very modern Orthodox synagogue, regular, like sort of the same as the synagogue I went to on one side of Central Park, this is on the other side of Central Park. All of a sudden he had this like anti-evolution view, and I was like, where is this coming from, And I knew later on there became, basically what I found in the dissertation is that anti-evolutionism in the Jewish community in America also actually started post-World War II, and it became sort of vocal in the 60s, which was very parallel to the Christian time frame. It was totally not what I was expecting to find in my dissertation. I found the Jewish story and the Christian story were very similar, because the Christian anti-evolutionists earlier in the 20th century also were not necessarily young earth creationists, and this was something that only came out also in the 60s. So the Jewish views and the Christian views were somewhat definitely parallel in some of their rhythms there. But this particular rabbi, and the question is why, so there are like 7 different reasons of why it was coming out then, but part of the reason is because scientists were using evolution sort of to bash religion. So then why would you be for this thing that was sort of contradicting your most precious thing in your life? But what happened in this particular community was there was a Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who you may have heard of.
Yeah, of course.
He's the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, but he started out as a modern Orthodox Jew, and he was the rabbi also in my synagogue on the other side of the park. And then he went and he was a sort of a junior rabbi there, and he became the head rabbi at the Jewish Center. And for a number of years, he didn't sort of tell people about this sort of change of heart and mind that he was going through. He sort of, on the outside, kept up his modern Orthodox identity, and then he came out and said, I have a different view. I have sort of a more evolutionary view, again, in his view of religion. He was sort of also influenced by evolution, thinking about religion. He has Reconstructionist Judaism. He started his own synagogue. And so this rabbi then took over right after Mordechai Kaplan. And obviously it would make sense why, if this congregation is reeling from this whole experience of someone who is heavily influenced by evolution, to reject the tradition and the way they understand expanded, and sort of he believes in a civilization of Judaism, sort of more along the lines of what you were talking about. He doesn't necessarily think you have to abandon the practice, but you do the practices because this is what our ancestors did. And at that time, Reconstructionist Judaism was sort of rejecting sort of the belief layer. It's interesting to see how, things have also changed and evolved within the denominations over the different centuries. Like, for example, in Reform Judaism and other denominations where there were certain things that were very important in the founding years. Also, contemporary members would think differently on those issues. But basically, so Rabbi Leo Young, who was the rabbi right after him, is the one in the Scopes trial who in the response to the Scopes trial, who is being more negative about evolution. Okay. So there you see, there's like the example sort of the social context. So it's not that you can't be anti-evolution from a Jewish perspective, but what would make you think that you should? Because you saw that it took a person sort of off the straight and narrow.
Yeah.
Whereas David DeSolapool, they've been there for many, many years. So this Jewish Center was this new synagogue with this new young rabbi who turned out to go in the other direction and then need to be rehabilitated. Spanish and Portuguese were having this very even keel. No one was, having all of these, just starting new denominations and stuff along those lines. And now I'm trying to figure out why I was bringing that example per se. But
I think it summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about, which is, what we have not been talking about is people actually digging in and critically engaging the biblical text, the tradition, and the details of evolutionary theory, right? We're actually talking about all these cultural reactions and formations and impacts and interactions. And I think, and that's part of what our workshop, our project is hoping to do, is actually to get people to do the deep critical interactive work, and then see how we can parlay that into these conversations out at these synagogues and mosques and churches as well. And
also just how we could all bear to be in the same room with each other when we don't agree about everything, and enjoy it actually, and want to hear people who think differently and bring different sorts of resources to the questions and conversations. I mean, that was really fun in the workshop, where everyone seemed to so enjoy when Rafi Zerum, a different Jewish participant, he brought all the midrashim, and people just seemed to love it. And I feel the same way. Like, my son loved Shoaib's presentation, where he was talking about Muslim philosophy. As I said to you before we started rolling, I think he wants to listen to Shoaib's episode on your podcast, because he was really drawn in, again, because he's 15 years old, and you're educated within a tradition, and to think about how that is similar and different to other traditions is fascinating. I know one of the people I work with, he likes to talk about learning in, from, and about religious traditions. So we're initiated into our tradition, and that's a certain kind of education, and it's usually the kind of education that needs to take place first. But once you are seeped in a certain tradition, it's so intriguing to learn about and then from other traditions. So
you would hope. It's
and
like
I love
learning
seeing
a
that
new
in
language.
real time in my kids. So.
I learned more about English by learning Spanish, right? I learned more about grammar by learning Spanish, because you have to do the backwards.
Yeah, I only realized how American I was when I started living in Israel.
Right, exactly. Well, Dr. Rachel S.A. Pear, I don't remember what your S and A stand for.
Shoulder Abrams.
Shoulder Abrams. Thank you for your wisdom, and you can all now hear why I'm so excited to work with her and Shoaib Malik on this project together. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.